Imagine being in the cockpit of a combat aircraft facing off against an entire enemy squadron. The odds are stacked against you. Their planes are faster, more advanced, and seemingly unstoppable. Your aircraft, on the other hand, feels sluggish. It's not as quick, it's not as powerful, and it's been underestimated by everyone around you, including the enemy. But what if the key to winning this battle isn't about speed or firepower? What if it's about using what you have and surprising the enemy when they least expect it? This is the story of how a seemingly underpowered plane and its pilot turned the tables on an enemy squadron in a way that no one saw coming. The enemy thought they had the upper hand. They had the advantage in speed, agility, and firepower. But they didn't account for one thing, the element of surprise. As the enemy squadron closed in, their confidence was unshaken. After all, they had been taught that an aircraft's speed was its greatest weapon. They expected, quick, decisive victory. What they didn't expect was that the very thing they thought would be the plane's weakness, its apparent lack of speed, was going to become its greatest strength. The pilot, knowing he was outmatched in terms of raw performance, decided to play the game differently. Instead of trying to outrun the enemy, he used his plane's slower speed to his advantage, luring the enemy into a false sense of security. He knew that their biggest flaw was their overconfidence and their underestimation of his aircraft. In the midst of this dogfight, this pilot performed a series of maneuvers that would seem counterintuitive to anyone who followed the conventional wisdom of aerial combat. He didn't try to escape the enemy. He engaged them head-on, forcing them to rethink their strategy. The slower aircraft, which was supposed to be a liability, became an unexpected weapon. With each unexpected move, the enemy's squadron started to falter. Their plans were thrown into disarray. What was initially thought to be a mismatch began to look like a stunning victory for the underdog. The pilot's courage and tactical ingenuity turned the tide in the air. How exactly did this play out? What made this pilot's tactics so surprising that the entire enemy squadron was caught off guard? To find out, let's take a closer look at the strategy behind this stunning victory. It was just another mission for Lieutenant Roberts, or so he thought. A relatively unknown pilot with only a handful of combat hours under his belt, he was flying a plane that had been dismissed by many as outdated, slow, and far from a match for the sophisticated aircraft of the enemy. But Roberts, unlike most of his peers, knew one thing that they didn't in war. It's not always about having the best machine, it's about knowing how to use what you've got. When Roberts first arrived at his squadron, he was immediately labeled the underdog. His aircraft, while capable, was old compared to the newer, faster models in the enemy's arsenal. His fellow pilots were quick to mock him, calling his plane a flying coffin or dismissing it as a relic from another era. But Roberts wasn't fazed. He knew something they didn't. Every aircraft has its strengths, and it's up to the pilot to discover how to exploit those. As he flew into the skies for his first mission, Roberts could feel the weight of expectation, rather, the lack of it. His fellow pilots were focused on their own superior aircraft, confident that their technology would carry them through. They didn't think twice about Roberts, assuming he'd be an easy target for the enemy forces. Little did they know that this very overconfidence would become their downfall. Roberts took a different approach than what was conventional in aerial combat. While the standard tactics focused on using speed and firepower to outmaneuver the enemy, Roberts realized that the real advantage didn't lie in brute force. It was in the subtlety of strategy, in waiting for the perfect moment to strike when the enemy least expected it. During the dogfight that followed, Roberts's plane performed far better than anyone anticipated. The enemy squadron, caught off guard by his calm demeanor and calculated movements, began to make mistakes. Their initial underestimation of his capabilities led them into a series of miscalculations that Roberts was quick to exploit. The key moment came when Roberts, in a display of sheer precision, executed a maneuver that few believed his aircraft was capable of as the enemy dove in for the kill. Roberts stayed calm and strategically placed himself in a position that forced them to overextend, giving him the perfect opportunity to strike. What was initially seen as a mismatch turned into a shocking victory for Roberts, proving that even the most underestimated pilot can outsmart an overconfident enemy. This story is a testament to the fact that it's not always the best machine that wins the battle, but rather the best pilot who knows how to outthink and outmaneuver the opposition. Roberts's victory was a clear message. Never underestimate someone based on appearances, especially in the chaos of war. At the heart of every significant shift in warfare lies innovation, and when it comes to aerial combat, technology often determines who will emerge victorious. But technology alone isn't always enough. Sometimes it takes a small but ingenious modification to turn the tide of an entire conflict. This was the case with one seemingly simple adjustment to the aircraft that changed everything. When Roberts first took to the skies in a seemingly underpowered aircraft, he knew that its lack of speed and firepower would be a problem, but what he didn't know was that an unnoticed innovation, a small technological tweak, would soon give him an edge that no one had anticipated. This wasn't a groundbreaking new weapon or a futuristic engine. Upgraded was a modification that improved the plane's maneuverability and reaction time, something that, when combined with Roberts's skill, would turn his plane into a deadly threat. The technology was simple, a modification to the control systems of the aircraft. This small tweak made the aircraft far more responsive to Roberts's inputs, allowing it to handle more agile maneuvers in combat. What had been a sluggish and cumbersome aircraft now felt like a finely tuned machine, responding faster than any of the enemy pilots expected. This change had a profound effect, not just on Roberts's own performance, but on how the entire squadron would approach aerial combat from that point onward. The brilliance of the modification lay not just in the upgrade itself, but in its subtlety. It wasn't something that could be easily detected by the enemy, nor was it something that could be easily replicated. While the enemy squadron relied on their advanced technology, they overlooked one crucial element. Sometimes the best weapon in war isn't the newest piece of tech, it's the ability to adapt and outmaneuver the opposition with whatever you have at your disposal. In an unexpected twist, this small tweak allowed Roberts to perform maneuvers that were previously impossible for his aircraft. This newfound agility caught the enemy squadron completely off guard, forcing them to change their tactics mid-air. What had once seemed like a clear advantage for the enemy, with their superior aircraft and technology, quickly became a battle of strategy and improvisation, with Roberts's modified aircraft pulling off maneuvers that were unimaginable just hours before. This is the essence of warfare. Not just relying on superior technology, but knowing how to use what you have more effectively than your adversaries. The modification wasn't something flashy or dramatic. It was small, unnoticed, and perhaps even considered unnecessary by many. But in the heat of battle, it made all the difference, changing the course of a fight and setting the stage for future air combat strategies. The lesson prohase. Innovation doesn't always need to be revolutionary. Sometimes it's about taking what's available and making it work for you in ways others might never expect. As the enemy squadron closed in, their confidence was palpable. They had trained for this moment, and their aircraft were the best technology that the enemy could offer. Their pilots were seasoned, their machines faster and more maneuverable than anything the Allies had at their disposal. They expected an easy victory. After all, with superior aircraft and firepower, how could they lose? But what they failed to realize was that in war, confidence can be a deadly flaw. It blinds you to the unexpected. It makes you underestimate your enemy, especially when that enemy is prepared to do the unthinkable. From the moment the dogfight began, the enemy pilots assumed that the slower aircraft would be easy targets. They had been trained to anticipate quick maneuvers and swift kills, and they expected the same from every Allied pilot. They were prepared for the standard tactics of high-speed dives, rapid climbs, and evasive action. But what they weren't prepared for was a pilot who didn't follow the rules. Roberts's aircraft, once dismissed as slow and outdated, moved in ways that surprised them. The initial shock was just the beginning. They began to realize that the standard aerial tactics they had used in every encounter before didn't work here. Their assumptions, their training, their overconfidence all crumbled in the face of an enemy who didn't play by the book. The enemy squadron's initial approach was textbook. They assumed Roberts's plane would be too slow to get into position or to react quickly enough to counter their attacks. They expected to outmaneuver him, to pick him off one by one. However, as the first few minutes of the engagement passed, it became clear that Roberts was doing something they didn't expect. Instead of trying to run from them, Roberts took the fight straight to them, using his aircraft's unique capabilities. His actions threw the enemy off balance. Where they had expected a slow, predictable target, they were faced with an opponent who used their own assumptions against them. It was as if the enemy pilots had walked into a trap of their own making. Each move they made seemed to be countered by Roberts in ways they hadn't anticipated. Every time they thought they had him cornered, he was gone, performing a maneuver that defied everything they thought they knew about aerial combat. Their confidence, once so high, began to waver. The pilots, who had been certain of their superiority just moments before, were now unsure of themselves. They had underestimated Roberts, and that mistake was costing them dearly. The more the enemy pilots tried to adapt to Roberts's unexpected tactics, the more they found themselves in a position they didn't understand. Roberts's aircraft, once thought of as a liability, was now outmaneuvering them at every turn. The turning point came when the squadron realized they were fighting not just a pilot, but an entire strategy that they were unprepared for. Their initial advantage, speed, and maneuverability was no longer enough. What seemed like a routine mission was now a battle of wits and willpower, and the enemy had underestimated their opponent. The squadron, once confident in their victory, now found themselves questioning their tactics, struggling to keep up with a pilot who had shown them that sometimes the greatest strength in war is the ability to surprise the enemy by breaking their expectations. In the midst of a fierce dogfight, as the enemy closed in from all sides, Roberts knew that the key to surviving was not just in outspeeding or outgunning the enemy. It was about making the right move at the right time. The art of aerial combat is about split-second decisions that can mean the difference between life and death. And Roberts, with his unconventional thinking, was about to make one of those decisions that would change the entire course of the battle. As the enemy squadron continued to close in, Roberts felt the familiar pressure building. His aircraft, though modified, was still at a disadvantage in terms of speed and firepower. But he had one advantage. The enemy didn't. He understood the unpredictability of combat. While the enemy pilots were focused on textbook tactics, Roberts was thinking outside the box, using his aircraft's unique qualities to his advantage. It was in this moment of tension that Roberts made a quick, decisive maneuver that would leave the enemy pilots scrambling to adjust. The decision was bold, almost reckless, but it worked. Instead of evading, Roberts pushed his aircraft into a move that no one expected. He turned directly into the enemy line of fire, forcing them to respond to him rather than the other way around. The immediate reaction from the enemy squadron was one of confusion. They had been expecting Roberts to retreat or take a defensive position, but instead he attacked. His move, though risky, disrupted the enemy's formation, throwing off their timing and coordination. What followed was a series of chaotic responses from the enemy pilots as they tried to adjust to a situation they hadn't anticipated. Roberts's bold maneuver allowed him to force the enemy into a defensive position. Instead of being a predictable target, he became the one calling the shots. The enemy pilots, now scrambling to regain control, found themselves out of sync with their usual tactics. They had trained to outmaneuver their opponent, but Roberts had turned that expectation on its head. By making the unexpected decision to confront them head-on, Roberts had effectively shifted the balance of power in the air. This was the turning point, the moment when Roberts went from being an underdog with a slow plane to being the dominant force in the sky. The enemy, who had once thought of him as an easy target, now found themselves struggling to keep up with his unconventional approach. And it all came down to one quick decision that completely changed the dynamics of the battle. As the dogfight continued, Roberts maintained his focus and composure. He knew that the real key to success wasn't just in the moves you made, but in your ability to read the battlefield and adapt to whatever challenges came your way. Roberts had proven that, with the right decision at the right moment, you could turn the tide of any battle, no matter how stacked the odds were against you. In war, one of the most powerful tools in any combatant's arsenal isn't always their weapons, their planes, or their technology. It's the ability to surprise the enemy. And in this instance, Roberts's slow and underestimated aircraft became the perfect vehicle for that very surprise. The enemy had been so certain of their superiority that they had failed to account for the possibility of an unexpected strategy, one that defied their expectations and forced them to react rather than dictate the fight. As Roberts continued to engage with the enemy squadron, something remarkable happened. The more they tried to outmaneuver him, the more their own tactics started to unravel. Roberts, flying a plane that they had initially written off, was now dictating the pace of the battle. His aircraft, which should have been too slow to keep up, was now using its agility and Roberts's quick thinking to break the enemy's rhythm. The first sign that the surprise was working came when Roberts, instead of attempting to run or outpace the enemy, positioned himself in a way that forced them into an unanticipated encounter. He didn't make a simple evasion or retreat. Instead, he put himself in a position where the enemy had no choice but to engage with him directly. What was initially thought to be a disadvantage, the slow speed of his aircraft, was now being used as a weapon of misdirection. The enemy was expecting a traditional dogfight, but Roberts had other plans. What followed was a series of unexpected moves from Roberts that caught the enemy off guard. He used his plane's ability to turn and change direction more smoothly than the enemy anticipated, exploiting the overconfidence of the enemy pilots who had assumed they could simply outspeed him. Their formation, which had been meticulously calculated to overwhelm Roberts, began to break down as they struggled to adjust to a fighter who didn't follow the traditional rules of combat. With each move, Roberts took advantage of their confusion. As they tried to chase him, he would force them into awkward positions where they couldn't use their plane's advantages. The slowest speed of his aircraft became a tool for him to manage the engagement on his terms, using the enemy's expectations against them. He didn't need to outrun them. He simply needed to keep them guessing. At one crucial moment, Roberts lured an enemy fighter into an engagement by using his plane's slower speed to bait them into a dangerous turn. The enemy pilot, expecting to have the advantage in the turn, was instead caught off guard as Roberts maneuvered into position and made the shot. In that moment, the once slow aircraft had outpaced its opponents in a different way, by outsmarting them. By the time the battle was over, Roberts had turned his plane from an object of ridicule to a weapon of choice. The power of surprise, his ability to manipulate the fight, stay unpredictable, and use his opponent's confidence against them had made all the difference. The enemy squadron, which had entered the battle with their usual tactics and expectations, was left scrambling, forced to rethink everything they knew about aerial combat. What Roberts had accomplished wasn't just a personal victory, it was a reminder that in warfare, surprise is often more valuable than superiority in firepower or speed. By breaking the enemy's expectations and turning his aircraft into a deceptive weapon, Roberts had proven that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in being faster, but in being smarter and more unpredictable. In the aftermath of the dogfight, as Roberts's aircraft returned to base, something became clear to both his allies and enemies alike. The true value of a combatant cannot be measured by appearances or preconceived expectations. The enemy had underestimated him based on the outward appearance of his aircraft. An older, slower plane, and the mistake had cost them dearly. But this wasn't just a lesson in combat. It was a lesson in humility, adaptability, and the power of rethinking the status quo. Roberts' success wasn't about the raw speed or firepower of his aircraft. It was about how he used what he had. The enemy, trained to believe that only superior technology could win the day, had failed to see the true power of adaptability and intelligence in warfare. Roberts, by contrast, had used his slower aircraft as a strategic advantage, bending the rules of aerial combat to his will. This was a powerful reminder that wars are not always won by the strongest force. They're often won by the one who can outthink and outmaneuver their opponents. After the battle, word quickly spread about the surprising turn of events. His fellow pilots, once skeptical of his aircraft and abilities, now saw Roberts in a new light. They had underestimated him just as much as the enemy had. The aircraft they thought would be an easy target had turned into a formidable weapon, and Roberts's unconventional tactics had become the key to his success. This realization also struck the enemy pilots, who would undoubtedly carry the memory of that engagement with them for the rest of the war. They had been caught off guard, their assumptions about combat challenged by a single pilot with a slow plane and a different way of thinking. The lesson was clear. Never judge a combatant or a situation by its appearance alone. The true strength of a fighter lies not just in the tools they wield, but in how they use them. Roberts' victory also sent a message to everyone watching the battle unfold. It wasn't enough to rely solely on superior technology. Technology might give you an edge, but it's strategy, quick thinking, and adaptability that will ultimately determine the outcome. The pilots who had underestimated Roberts had assumed that the more advanced technology would ensure their victory. But it wasn't the aircraft that mattered. It was the person flying it, the decisions they made, and their ability to outsmart the enemy. This battle would go down in history not just as a victory for Roberts, but as a pivotal moment in understanding that war is not just about technology or strength. It's about using those things in ways that others don't expect and making the most of every advantage, no matter how small it might seem. Throughout history, aerial combat has been defined by moments of unexpected brilliance. Pilots who defied the odds, used unconventional tactics, and turned the tide of battles with seemingly impossible maneuvers. While the world has witnessed countless technological advances in the sky, the fundamental truth of aerial warfare remains unchanged. No matter how advanced the technology, there is always room for the unexpected. The battle fought by Roberts and his aircraft serves as a perfect example of this timeless truth, even in an age of rapidly advancing technology. It's not always the best or most advanced weapon that wins the war. It's often the one who knows how to use their assets in ways that the enemy cannot anticipate. The story of Roberts, with his slow plane, is now part of aviation legend. His success has been studied by pilots and historians alike, offering valuable lessons on the unpredictable nature of aerial warfare. But this wasn't a one-off. The skies are full of stories like Roberts's. Legendary pilots from different wars, different time periods, have all shared the same trait: an ability to defy expectations and surprise the enemy. Whether it's a slow-moving bomber, outmaneuvering enemy fighters, or a novice pilot taking on an experienced squadron, history is full of tallies where technology alone didn't win the day. Instead, it was the pilot's ability to adapt and think on their feet that made all the difference. Take, for example, the legendary World War II ace Adolf Galland, who famously said, "The enemy is in front of you. You only have to think and act faster than him." It's a simple statement, but one that holds true in every engagement. Galland's success wasn't based on superior technology alone. It was his ability to read the battlefield and anticipate the moves of his opponents that set him apart. Similarly, Roberts, with his slower plane, managed to stay one step ahead of his enemy because he didn't fall into the trap of relying solely on the technology at his disposal. Instead, he used his aircraft's weaknesses as an asset, turning the tables on a technologically superior enemy. What makes these stories so compelling and so important for us to remember is that they show us the value of thinking differently in the heat of battle. In modern warfare, where advanced technology and weaponry often dominate the conversation, it's easy to forget that sometimes the most important weapon is the mind of the pilot, the strategy they employ, and the surprises they bring to the fight. This principle extends beyond the air. In any battlefield, land, sea, or sky, success often hinges on the ability to outthink your opponent, to force them to adapt to your strategy rather than the other way around. The element of surprise is one of the oldest tricks in the military playbook, and yet it remains as relevant as ever. Aerial warfare, in particular, continues to evolve, but the essence of what makes it successful remains unchanged. Whether you're flying a cutting-edge fighter jet or a slower, older plane, the principles of surprise, strategy, and adaptability never lose their value. The legacy of those pilots who defied expectations continues to inspire new generations of aviators, proving that in the sky, as in all aspects of war, innovation isn't just about new technology, it's about new ways of thinking. In the chaos of war, it's easy to become fixated on the obvious: speed, firepower, and technology. These are the traits that dominate headlines, that military strategists focus on, and that become symbols of superiority. However, history has shown that the greatest weapons of war are often the ones that are invisible to the eye. While advanced weaponry certainly plays a significant role, it is sometimes the unseen and overlooked factors that can shift the balance in an instant. In the case of Roberts's seemingly slow aircraft, the true weapon was not its raw firepower or its top speed, but rather a small, subtle modification that made all the difference. The Modification was not some shiny new piece of high-tech gadgetry. It was a simple adjustment to the control system, a fine-tuning of the aircraft that allowed it to respond with precision and agility when it mattered most. This small change, hidden in plain sight, became a game-changer in aerial combat. But this story is not unique to aviation. Throughout military history, small, subtle adjustments or even overlooked aspects of equipment have had profound impacts on the outcome of battles. For example, the development of the tank during World War I wasn't just about its firepower, it was about how the tank's tracks allowed it to traverse difficult terrain that previous machines couldn't handle. The tank became the answer to a problem that no one had fully anticipated. Similarly, during World War II, the development of radar didn't just revolutionize air warfare. It transformed the entire strategic approach to defense and attack. In many instances, the hidden elements of war, whether they be strategic innovations, tactical surprises, or subtle improvements to existing equipment, are the ones that make the most significant impact. They disrupt the expectations of the enemy and render their advanced technology less effective. This is precisely what happened in Roberts' case. The enemy was so focused on their own superior technology that they failed to see how a small modification could turn the tables. Even in the modern age, the military continues to invest heavily in new technologies, but the lessons of the past remind us that it's not always the most advanced weapon that wins the battle. It's the one that can adapt in surprise. Military leaders know this well, which is why they constantly seek to innovate, not just in terms of weaponry, but also in terms of tactics, logistics, and the use of existing technology in new ways. The real power of any weapon, whether on the ground, in the air, or at sea, lies in how it's used. Sometimes it's the smallest change, the simplest tweak that can make the most significant difference in the outcome of a war. The real hidden weapon in war, then, is the ability to adapt, to innovate, and to recognize the potential of what others might overlook. As we reflect on the story of Roberts and his surprising victory in the sky, we realize that his actions were not just a single moment of success in an isolated battle. They represent a larger truth about warfare innovation, and the ability to adapt can change the course of history. Roberts, with his underpowered aircraft and unconventional tactics, demonstrated that sometimes the greatest strength in war isn't about having the best technology, but about how you use the technology you have. This lesson is timeless, and it applies to every conflict, from the battlefields of World War II to the modern day. The ability to innovate, to think beyond the expected, has always been the hallmark of successful military leaders. Whether it's on the ground, in the air, or at sea, those who can see the battlefield not just as it is, but as it could be, have the power to change the outcome of a war. Roberts' story is a perfect example of this principle. He didn't have the fastest plane, the most advanced weaponry, or the most powerful technology. What he had was an understanding of his aircraft's potential, an ability to adapt to the situation, and the courage to execute unconventional strategies that caught the enemy off guard. This legacy of innovation continues to shape the way we approach warfare today. As technologies advances, new weapons are introduced and new tactics are developed, but the core idea remains unchanged. It's not just about the tools you have, it's about how you use them. In many ways, the principles Roberts demonstrated are strategic thinking and the willingness to surprise the enemy are just as relevant today as they were in the skies above the battlefield. The world of modern warfare may be dominated by drones, cyber attacks, and high-tech weaponry. But the lessons of history remind us that the ability to surprise, to innovate, and to think outside the box remains crucial. Roberts' victory didn't just change the outcome of that particular dogfight, it changed how we think about air combat, tactics, and the art of war itself. For those who fight in wars, whether in the air, on the ground, or at sea, it's essential to remember that sometimes it's the smallest and most unexpected changes that can make the biggest difference. Just as Roberts' aircraft, once dismissed as too slow to win, became the key to his success, so too can the most unlikely strategies prove to be the most effective. If this story has moved you, and you believe that the lessons of history deserve to be shared and remembered, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button to help us share these forgotten stories, and leave a comment telling us what surprised you most about Roberts' tactics. Share your thoughts, ask questions, or just let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for watching. And don't forget to check out our next video for more inspiring stories from history's great battles.